I never thought a normal workday would turn into something that still keeps me awake months later, because until that afternoon, my CEO was just a name on emails and a presence in quarterly meetings, someone powerful but distant, someone I respected and honestly feared a little in the professional sense. She was 45, sharp, composed, always perfectly controlled, and I was 27, still trying to prove I deserved my role in a company where every mistake felt visible. When her assistant messaged me during the break and said the CEO wanted to see me in her office, I assumed it was about a report I had submitted earlier that week, or a project timeline that needed clarification. My stomach tightened, but that wasn't unusual. Everyone felt that way when her name came up. Her office was on the top floor, quiet, separated from the noise of the rest of the building, and when I knocked and stepped inside, she closed the door behind me without saying much. The room felt different immediately, not hostile, just heavy, like the air had shifted. She asked me to sit, her tone calm, almost casual, and started talking about my performance, saying she had noticed my dedication, my long hours, the way I handled pressure. At first, I felt relieved, even proud, because praise from her was rare and meaningful. Then the conversation drifted, slowly, into territory that didn't feel like work anymore. She stood, walked around the desk, and positioned herself closer than necessary, close enough that I became aware of how quiet the room was, how far away everyone else suddenly felt. I told myself I was overthinking, that powerful people sometimes had strange communication styles, that I just needed to listen and respond professionally. When she locked the door, I noticed it, but I didn't immediately understand why it unsettled me. It was only a click, after all, and offices needed privacy for sensitive discussions. She said something about trust, about ambition, about how success often came from complicated moments that tested your judgment. My heart was beating faster than it should have, and I remember thinking I should steer the conversation back to work, but before I could, she closed the distance completely. The moment crossed a line so quickly that my brain lagged behind my body, and suddenly I wasn't in a meeting anymore. I was in a situation I hadn't agreed to and didn't know how to navigate. I froze, not because I wanted to be there, but because shock does that to you, especially when the person standing over you controls your career, your income, your future. I remember the sofa, the unfamiliar angle of the room from where I was sitting, the strange disconnect of noticing small details like the texture of the fabric or the faint hum of the building while my thoughts scrambled for something logical to say. She spoke quietly, confidently, as if this was all perfectly normal, as if I should understand what she was offering without her having to spell it out. In that moment, I realized how unprepared I was for the imbalance between us, how authority can turn confusion into silence, how quickly professionalism can collapse when power is misused. When it was over, when she stepped back and adjusted herself as if nothing unusual had happened, she reminded me that discretion mattered in this company, that misunderstandings could ruin promising careers, that trust worked both ways. I left her office feeling hollow, my break long over, my head buzzing, walking past coworkers who had no idea that the version of the workplace I believed in no longer existed. I didn't tell anyone that day or the next or the week after, because I didn't even know how to name what had happened, only that something had shifted permanently, and the job I once felt grateful for now felt like a trap I didn't know how to escape. The days after that meeting blurred together in a way that made time feel unreliable, like I was moving through the office on autopilot while something heavy followed just behind me, close enough that I could feel it but never see it. I went back to my desk that afternoon and answered emails, joined calls, nodded at jokes in the break room, all while replaying the moment in her office again and again, trying to reframe it into something less disturbing, something that made sense in a professional world where lines were supposed to be clear. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, that maybe I had misread her intentions, that powerful people lived by different rules and I just didn't understand them yet. But every time I passed her floor or saw her name pop up in my inbox, my chest tightened in a way that logic couldn't explain away. She didn't contact me immediately, which somehow made it worse, because the silence felt deliberate, like a test I didn't know I was taking. When she finally did reach out a few days later, it was through a short, neutral email asking for an update on a project. Nothing personal, nothing that acknowledged what had happened. And that normality made me question my own reaction even more. I started noticing how carefully she controlled every interaction, how she never spoke to me alone again without a reason that could be documented, how she made sure there were always others nearby, and that precision told me more than any apology could have. I became hyper-aware of my behavior, of how I dressed, how I spoke, how quickly I responded to messages, because it felt like any misstep could be interpreted as consent, ingratitude, or defiance, depending on what suited her narrative. At night, I lay awake imagining scenarios where I reported what happened, playing out conversations with HR that ended in polite smiles and quiet warnings, or worse, subtle retaliation disguised as restructuring and performance reviews. I knew the company's policies by heart, knew the language about safe workplaces and zero tolerance, but I also knew who signed off on budgets, promotions, and quiet exits, and that knowledge made every option feel risky. I started keeping notes on my phone, dates and times and exact wording from emails, not because I had a plan yet, but because some instinct told me I might need proof one day, even if I wasn't sure what I'd be proving. Friends outside of work noticed the change before anyone inside did. They said I seemed distracted, tense, less excited about a job I used to talk about with pride, and I brushed them off with vague complaints about stress and deadlines, because explaining the truth felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. The hardest part was the isolation, the sense that I was carrying something invisible while everyone else moved freely, unaware that the rules I believed in no longer applied equally. I watched how people spoke about her with admiration, how they praised her leadership and vision, and I wondered if they would look at me differently if they knew, if they would see a victim or a problem, a liability that disrupted the image of a successful company. Slowly, the excitement I once felt about my career was replaced by calculation, by a constant assessment of risk versus survival, and I realized that whatever had happened in that office hadn't just crossed a personal boundary, it had reshaped how I understood power, trust, and the cost of staying silent. By the end of that week, I knew I couldn't keep pretending nothing had changed, but I still didn't know what my next move would be, only that the longer I stayed quiet, the more control I felt slipping away, and that scared me more than the consequences of speaking up ever had. What unsettled me most as the weeks went on wasn't just the memory of that day, but how efficiently the workplace absorbed it, like nothing disruptive had ever happened, like the building itself was designed to swallow discomfort and keep moving. I began to notice small shifts that might have meant nothing on their own, but felt intentional when seen together. Projects I'd been leading were reassigned without explanation, meetings I was usually invited to suddenly happened without me, and feedback that used to be direct and constructive became vague, wrapped in language that hinted at disappointment without ever naming a problem. I couldn't tell whether this was punishment, caution, or coincidence, and the uncertainty gnawed at me more than outright hostility would have. Every interaction with her was now public, polished, almost rehearsed, and she treated me with a professional distance that bordered on indifference, as if erasing any trace of familiarity would also erase what had occurred. That distance made me feel smaller, like my experience only existed in my own head, unsupported by evidence anyone else could see. I found myself scanning conversations for subtext, wondering whether colleagues noticed the changes, or if they simply accepted them as part of corporate life where priorities shift and people fall out of favor all the time. The idea that this could be written off as normal made me question my instincts, made me wonder if I was overreacting, if this was just how power worked, and I was naive to expect fairness. I tried to focus on my work, telling myself that performance was the one thing I could control, but even that began to feel fragile when effort didn't lead to recognition anymore. Late one evening, while organizing files, I came across an old onboarding document about reporting misconduct, and I stared at it longer than I meant to, reading the same lines repeatedly without absorbing them, because the words promised protection in a way that felt theoretical rather than real. I imagined sitting across from someone whose job it was to listen, imagined explaining everything calmly and clearly, and then imagined the pause afterward, the moment where they weighed my account against her reputation, her influence, her history of success, and I couldn't picture that equation ending in my favor. Outside of work, the stress leaked into everything else. I canceled plans, avoided conversations about my job, and felt a constant low-level anxiety that made even small decisions feel exhausting. I realized I was carrying a sense of shame that didn't belong to me, a quiet belief that if I'd acted differently, spoken differently, maybe none of this would have happened, and that belief was harder to shake than anger ever was. One night, after too little sleep and too much thinking, I opened the notes I'd been keeping and read them from the beginning, seeing the pattern more clearly laid out than it felt in my head. And that clarity scared me, because it meant I couldn't keep telling myself it was nothing. I started researching options in private, reading about others who had been in similar situations, noticing how often the stories ended with compromise rather than justice, with people leaving quietly to protect themselves while the system stayed intact. That realization forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding. Staying might cost me my sense of self, but speaking up might cost me my career, and neither option felt fair or safe. As the pressure built, I understood that whatever choice I made would define not just how this situation ended, but how I would see myself afterward, and that realization brought a new kind of resolve, not loud or dramatic, but steady, the kind that forms when you finally accept that pretending everything is fine is no longer an option. By the time I reached the point where silence felt heavier than risk, I had already begun to change in ways that were subtle but undeniable. I spoke less in meetings, choosing words carefully as if every sentence might be misunderstood, and I stopped volunteering for visibility, telling myself it was temporary, even as I sensed it becoming a habit. The office no longer felt like a place where I was building something. It felt like a place I was surviving, counting hours instead of milestones. I noticed how often decisions were made behind closed doors now, how frequently my manager deferred to higher authority without explanation, and how that authority always seemed to trace back to her, even when she wasn't in the room. It became clear that power didn't need to announce itself to be effective. It operated quietly, shaping outcomes without leaving fingerprints. I began documenting everything more carefully, not just the obvious changes, but the small interactions that left me uneasy, the casual remarks that hinted at expectations I hadn't agreed to, the moments where professionalism felt performative rather than genuine. Writing things down gave me a sense of control, even if it was limited, and helped me separate facts from the constant swirl of doubt in my head. At the same time, I confided in one friend outside the company, someone who had no stake in the outcome, and saying the words out loud made them sound more real, less like a story I'd invented to explain my discomfort. Their reaction was calm but firm, and that steadiness grounded me when my own thoughts spiraled towards self-blame. Still, the fear of retaliation lingered, fueled by stories I'd read and the unspoken rules I sensed around me, rules that favored those at the top and expected everyone else to adapt. I weighed my options endlessly, considering whether a transfer, a quiet exit, or formal action would do the least damage, and each path seemed to demand a different kind of sacrifice. Some nights I lay awake imagining the future version of myself looking back on this moment, wondering which choice I would regret more, and that imagined gaze pushed me to think beyond immediate consequences. I started to see how staying silent was already shaping my identity, teaching me to accept discomfort as normal and to prioritize stability over integrity, and that realization was unsettling because it suggested a slow erosion rather than a single decisive loss. At work, her presence remained controlled and distant, but there were moments when our eyes met across a room and the weight of unspoken history pressed in, reminding me that ignoring something doesn't make it disappear, it just forces it underground. I recognized that the company's emphasis on values and transparency rang hollow when tested by reality, and that dissonance made it harder to believe in the mission I'd once been excited about. As I gathered more information and clarity, a shift began to happen inside me, a quiet acceptance that there was no perfect outcome waiting if I just thought long enough. Instead, there was only the choice to act in alignment with what I could live with afterward. That understanding didn't erase my fear, but it reframed it, turning anxiety into something closer to determination. And as I prepared for the next step, whatever it might be, I knew that reclaiming my voice would be uncomfortable, messy, and uncertain, but continuing to suppress it had already proven to be its own kind of cost. The decision to move forward didn't arrive as a dramatic moment of clarity, but as a gradual narrowing of options, like a corridor closing in until only one direction remained. I scheduled a meeting with HR under the pretense of discussing workload concerns, choosing a neutral entry point because I still wasn't ready to lead with the truth. Walking into that room, I felt the familiar tension return, the instinct to minimize, to present everything as manageable. But something had shifted since I started documenting my experiences. The notes grounded me, anchoring my memory to specifics rather than feelings. And when the conversation turned toward my recent disengagement, I let the facts surface slowly, carefully, without embellishment. I described changes in responsibilities, missed meetings, and the sense of exclusion that had followed, watching their expressions for signs of recognition or resistance. They listened, took notes, and asked procedural questions, and while the tone was polite, it was also distant, reminding me that this was a system built to manage risk as much as resolve harm. When they asked if there was anything else contributing to my discomfort, the pause that followed felt longer than it probably was, and in that space I understood that backing out now would mean carrying this alone indefinitely. I spoke then, not with anger or accusation, but with a steady recounting of what had happened, sticking to actions and timelines, resisting the urge to justify my reactions. Saying it aloud in that setting was both relieving and terrifying, because once spoken, it could no longer be contained or controlled. The response was measured, almost rehearsed, assurances about confidentiality, processes, and investigations that sounded reasonable yet abstract, and I left the room with a mix of hope and dread that settled into a heavy calm. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at work changed again, this time more noticeably, as if an invisible line had been crossed. I was advised not to discuss the matter with colleagues, a request framed as protection, but one that reinforced my isolation. Meetings were postponed, decisions delayed, and communication filtered through intermediaries, creating a sense of suspension where nothing resolved and nothing progressed. I wrestled with second thoughts, wondering if I'd miscalculated, if the cost of speaking up would outweigh any potential outcome. But each time doubt crept in, I returned to my notes and reminded myself why I'd started this process. Outside the office, I began to reclaim parts of my life that had shrunk under stress, reconnecting with routines and people I'd neglected, finding small relief in normalcy. Those moments didn't erase the anxiety, but they reminded me that my identity extended beyond this situation, beyond the company's walls and hierarchy. Eventually, I was informed that an internal review was underway, though details were sparse, and that I might be contacted for further clarification. The lack of transparency was frustrating, yet I recognized that resolution, if it came at all, would be slow and imperfect. As weeks passed, I noticed my own resilience growing, not because the process was fair or easy, but because I was no longer expending energy pretending everything was fine. I began to think about contingency plans, updating my resume, exploring opportunities elsewhere, not as an admission of defeat, but as a form of agency. Whatever the outcome, I wanted choices, and preparing for them felt empowering. Through it all, I grappled with conflicting emotions toward her: anger at the misuse of power, confusion over her subsequent detachment, and a lingering wish that none of this had happened at all. Yet that wish slowly gave way to acceptance, an understanding that the past couldn't be rewritten, only acknowledged. By choosing to act, even within a flawed system, I had asserted something fundamental about my worth and boundaries, and that assertion mattered, regardless of how the story would ultimately end. As I waited for the next development, I held on to that truth, knowing that while the process might test my patience and resolve, it had already altered the way I saw myself, not as someone defined by silence, but as someone capable of confronting discomfort in pursuit of integrity. The longer the review stretched on, the more I understood that time itself had become a tool, one that dulled urgency and blurred accountability. Weeks passed with little more than brief check-ins that offered no substance, and I learned to read between the lines of carefully worded emails that acknowledged my patience without rewarding it. In that space of waiting, I began to observe the company with new eyes, noticing how easily momentum returned for everyone else, while my own role remained suspended, as if my presence had become an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a contribution to be valued. I was assigned temporary tasks that kept me busy but disconnected from long-term goals, work that filled hours without building a future. And while no one said it outright, the message was clear enough. I started to sense how organizations protect themselves by normalizing ambiguity, by making the absence of resolution feel routine until people stop expecting more. That realization brought a mix of anger and clarity, because it meant the outcome might never match the effort I'd put into speaking up. Still, I held on to the fact that choosing to act had already shifted something internally, even if the external process lagged behind. I focused on maintaining professionalism, documenting each interaction, and keeping my performance steady, not out of loyalty, but to protect myself from narratives that could be used against me. Outside of work, I continued exploring alternatives, scheduling informational conversations, and quietly rebuilding confidence that had eroded under months of uncertainty. Those conversations reminded me that my skills were transferable, that the version of me stuck in limbo wasn't the whole story, just a chapter shaped by circumstance. There were moments when doubt resurfaced, when I questioned whether I should have handled things differently, chosen a quieter path, or left earlier. But those thoughts gradually lost their grip as I recognized them as part of the emotional aftermath rather than evidence of failure. One afternoon, I was asked to provide a follow-up statement, clarifying details I'd already shared, and while the repetition felt exhausting, it also signaled that the process was moving, however slowly. Writing it forced me to revisit events with precision, to strip them of emotion and present them plainly, and that exercise reinforced my understanding of what had crossed a line and why it mattered. After submitting it, I felt a strange calm, not because I expected justice, but because I'd reached the limit of what I could reasonably do within the system. The outcome was no longer entirely in my control, and accepting that freed up energy I'd been spending on constant vigilance. I began setting boundaries around how much mental space this situation occupied, redirecting focus toward health, relationships, and future plans that didn't depend on any single employer. At work, interactions remained cautious and formal, but the tension eased slightly as the novelty of the situation faded, replaced by a resigned normalcy that felt both comforting and unsettling. I realized that organizations are adept at absorbing disruption and returning to equilibrium, even when individuals are left altered in the process. That understanding strengthened my resolve to prioritize my own well-being over institutional expectations. As I waited for the review's conclusion, I prepared myself for multiple outcomes, from minimal consequences to quiet recommendations, and I practiced accepting each possibility without letting it define my worth. The experience had already taught me hard lessons about power, vulnerability, and the cost of silence, lessons I knew would inform how I navigated future environments. By the end of that period, I no longer measured progress by official updates, but by my own sense of alignment, by whether my actions reflected the values I wanted to live by. In that sense, regardless of what the final report might say, I had reclaimed a measure of control, and that reclamation felt like the beginning of something steadier, a foundation not based on certainty, but on self-trust. The conclusion of the review arrived without ceremony, delivered in a brief meeting that felt carefully structured to minimize reaction. I was told that the investigation had been completed, that appropriate steps had been taken, and that for reasons of confidentiality, details could not be shared. The language was neutral, practiced, and intentionally vague, the kind that closes a door while insisting it remains open. I listened, asked a few clarifying questions that led nowhere, and nodded in places where disagreement would have required energy I no longer had. Walking out of that room, I felt a familiar mix of disappointment and relief, not because the outcome was satisfying, but because the waiting was finally over. The uncertainty that had stretched for months had been its own burden, and even an imperfect ending felt lighter than endless suspension. In the days that followed, subtle shifts confirmed what the meeting hadn't said outright. She was no longer involved in day-to-day operations in the same way. Her presence reduced, her influence less visible, though still intact in the background. Nothing dramatic happened, no public acknowledgement, no clear sense of accountability, just a quiet reorganization that allowed the company to move forward without disruption. I understood then that this was likely the best outcome the system was designed to produce, one that balanced internal risk rather than individual closure. Strangely, that realization didn't break me the way I'd once feared it might. Instead, it clarified my priorities, stripping away any lingering illusions about fairness within corporate structures. I returned to my role with a different mindset, doing my work competently, but without the emotional investment I once had, recognizing that loyalty had limits and that self-preservation wasn't a weakness. Colleagues treated me as they always had, unaware of the full story, and I stopped trying to read meaning into every interaction, letting go of the need for validation. Outside of work, my job search became more focused, guided by lessons learned rather than desperation, and interviews felt different now, informed by sharper questions about culture, leadership, and accountability. I spoke more openly with friends about what I wanted next, not framing my experience as a defining trauma, but as a turning point that had clarified my boundaries. There were still moments of anger, flashes of frustration when I thought about how easily the situation had been contained and managed, but those moments no longer dominated my thinking. Instead, they served as reminders of what I would no longer tolerate, internal markers that strengthened rather than weakened my resolve. One evening, while reviewing an offer from another company, I realized how far I'd come from the version of myself who had first walked into that office feeling confused and powerless. That version hadn't known how to name what was happening, hadn't trusted his instincts, and had assumed that professionalism meant endurance. The person I was now understood that professionalism also includes boundaries, that respect isn't implied by titles, and that silence often benefits those already protected. Accepting the new role felt like closing a chapter on my own terms, not as an escape, but as a deliberate step forward. When I submitted my resignation, the process was smooth and uneventful, another reminder of how easily individuals can be replaced, but this time that knowledge didn't sting. On my last day, I cleared my desk quietly, exchanged polite goodbyes, and left without looking back, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't expected. The experience hadn't ended with the justice I once imagined, but it had reshaped my understanding of agency and self-worth. As I stepped into the next phase of my career, I carried with me a clearer sense of what mattered, a commitment to speak sooner, trust myself more deeply, and build a life that didn't require shrinking to fit someone else's power. Starting over brought a quiet adjustment period that felt both unfamiliar and grounding, like learning to walk on steady ground after months of compensating for uneven footing. In my new role, the expectations were clear, the structure transparent enough that ambiguity didn't linger in the corners of everyday interactions. I noticed how quickly my body responded to that difference, how tension eased when feedback was straightforward and meetings had purpose instead of subtext. Trust rebuilt itself slowly, not because I forgot what had happened, but because I learned how to recognize the early signs of misalignment and address them before they took root. I paid closer attention to how leadership handled conflict, how policies were explained and applied, and how people spoke about one another when no authority was present, understanding now that culture reveals itself most clearly in those unguarded moments. Outside of work, I continued the practices that had sustained me through uncertainty, keeping routines that anchored my days and relationships that reminded me who I was beyond any job title. When I looked back on the experience, it no longer felt like a single defining event, but a series of choices that had gradually shaped a different outcome than silence would have allowed. I didn't frame the story as a victory or a defeat. Instead, I saw it as an education that came at a cost, one that forced me to understand power not as something abstract, but as something that lives in decisions, access, and the ability to set boundaries. There were moments when memories resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by a familiar tone or an echo of a past environment, but those moments passed more easily now, met with awareness rather than avoidance. I learned that healing wasn't about erasing discomfort, but about integrating it without letting it dictate my direction. Conversations with others who shared their own experiences reinforced that sense of shared understanding, and while I didn't offer advice, I listened in ways I hadn't known how to before, recognizing how much weight validation can carry. Over time, the urge to revisit the past diminished, replaced by a focus on building something sustainable in the present, something aligned with values that felt non-negotiable now. I began setting clearer expectations in all areas of my life, practicing direct communication even when it felt awkward, trusting that clarity was kinder than assumption. The lessons extended beyond work, shaping how I navigated relationships, made decisions, and assessed risk, reminding me that growth often comes from moments we never would have chosen. Occasionally, I wondered how things might have unfolded differently if the system had worked as promised, but that curiosity no longer carried resentment. It simply acknowledged reality as it was. What mattered more was how I had responded once I understood my options, how I had chosen to act despite uncertainty. That choice became a reference point, a reminder that agency doesn't require perfect conditions, only the willingness to move forward without guarantees. As time passed, the experience settled into perspective, no longer dominating my narrative, but informing it in quiet, meaningful ways. I felt a renewed confidence in my ability to navigate complex environments without losing myself, a confidence rooted not in invulnerability, but in resilience and self-respect. Looking ahead, I understood that challenges would continue to arise, that no path is free of imbalance or risk, but I also knew I had the tools to respond with awareness and intention. The story didn't end with closure in the traditional sense. It ended with continuity, with a life that kept unfolding beyond a single chapter. And in that ongoing movement, I found something steadier than resolution, a sense of alignment that made each next step feel chosen rather than endured, a quiet assurance that my voice, once reclaimed, would remain present in whatever came next.